Um, David Barry, Green Borders Online Magazine. We're recording from the Orphan Institute of Preventative Medicine, and our guest today is Hannah Brisden, a nutritionist, and we're going to be talking about Cash and Salt Awareness Week. Can you tell our readers and watchers, Hannah, what CASH stands for?
CASH stands for Consensus Action on Salt and Health, and we're a group of experts in salt reduction and blood pressure. So we look at trying to get the food industry to reduce the amount of salt in our food to try and reduce our risk of heart disease and high blood pressure.
So is that the mission and aim of CASH then?
Yes, our aim is ultimately for us all to be eating less salt. We're currently eating about 9 grams of salt, and the maximum recommendation is 6 grams, and we actually need much less, more like a gram. So we're all eating too much salt, and ultimately we want everyone to be eating less. And the primary way that we want to do this is by getting the food industry to reduce the amount of salt in our food, because 75% of the salt we're eating is in the food that we buy in the supermarket.
We're in the middle of Salt Awareness Week. How's it going?
It's going really well, actually. Yesterday we had a press release out about the salt content of pizzas, and we were looking at the difference in salt levels between takeaway and supermarket pizzas, and we found that takeaway pizzas were much higher in salt and fat, and this is really quite worrying because there's no labelling available. So when you go into a takeaway or a restaurant, you are eating, so much more salt than in a supermarket, and there's just no way of knowing. So that was yesterday, so that was quite exciting. And then we also produce a number of leaflets and resources for healthcare professionals for them to do their own events around the country. And this year we've got over 600 events going on around the country trying to raise awareness about the health effects of too much salt. So we're really, really pleased with how it's going so far.
Are you going into the schools as well?
We're not personally, but there are people who are going into schools, going into community groups like libraries, and then healthcare professionals in doctor surgeries, hospitals, and other sort of community groups.
And how do you measure the success of Salt Awareness Week?
Well, a number of ways. We do it based on the number of leaflets that we distribute and the number of events that go on around the country, and then also by our press coverage. So we issue a press release and we look at the success of that, but also the other press things that go on around Salt Awareness Week. So last week we had some sort of psyching up for Salt Awareness Week pieces in the newspapers, and then towards the end of this week and next week we'll hope to have some other sort of interesting facts about salt and things in the news. So we sort of just look at how the reach is going. And we also have a House of Commons reception tomorrow. And this is a chance for us to sort of speak to the MPs and the peers about salt reduction and government issues surrounding salt, but also for the food industry to let us know and let each other know how they're coming along with salt reduction. So sort of how much salt they've reduced from their products is another way that we can assess sort of our progress and our achievements generally, not just for the week.
Is the government doing enough to address this issue?
Enough? No. They're doing a fair amount. They have included salt as one of the key pledges as part of the responsibility deal, which is the government's public health sort of strategy, where they're working with the food industry to get them to commit to a number of different nutritional and drink-related pledges. So salt is one of them, and over 70 companies have signed up to meet a series of salt reduction targets by the end of this year. So from that point of view, that's really good, and the food industry, at least the manufacturing and supermarket sector, is well on the way. However, there is currently no targets or anything in place post-2012, and the sort of strategy that we've got now is only going to bring us down to 7.5 grams, and that is if everyone complies. So there's obviously still a long way to go for us to meet 6 grams, so we're really urging them to do more sort of in terms of the future. And also for the catering sector, as I mentioned before, the pizza survey showed...
Why is takeaway pizzas a particular problem?
Well, it's not takeaway pizzas specifically, that was just what we looked at, but takeaways generally.
Why?
Well, they've sort of been left behind because there's so many independent outlets out there. It's much more difficult to get through to them. You might have sort of a family business, and generally when we were first setting up, it was a big thing to get to supermarkets. They were sort of our primary focus. If you get Sainsbury's, then that's obviously reaching a lot of people. However, now the supermarkets and the manufacturers, so big family brands, are making the reductions. It now means that the takeaway sector is lagging behind and more work does need to be done. And I know it is. Some of the London boroughs, for instance, they're quite into public health and are trying to incorporate nutrition into their visits. So they do a lot of food safety and general hygiene checks and things for all of the outlets in their area. And they're actually trying to include nutrition as part of that. So we produce with them a leaflet on reducing the salt and fat levels of pizzas.
Why do takeaway establishments use too much salt?
Well, I think part of it is they just don't necessarily know that it's a bad thing. I think it's quite a cheap it's a cheap flavour, and they just sort of are not really aware.
And what's the function of the salt? Why do food manufacturers use salt?
Well, historically, and we're talking a long time ago, it was originally started to be used as a preservative. However, it's actually not needed as a preservative really anymore. It's quite a bad preservative. And we have fridges, we have freezers, we have canning, we have jarring, we have all sorts of systems now that we can use to make our food last longer. So for that point of view, the need for salt is much lower than it sort of was once. It also does have a function as flavour, but it's a very cheap form of flavour, and there's much nicer flavours out there, herbs, spices.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is there a true alternative to salt?
Well, from a sort of cooking point of view, yes, you can use lemon juice is quite good for bringing out other flavours. That's sort of what salt is thought to do. So lemon juice is quite a good alternative, and also just using more herbs and spices if you're cooking at home. They're all really good things to use. You can also get some potassium salts, which have lower sodium and more potassium. And these are quite good because they obviously have less of the sodium, which is what's actually bad for our health, and also more potassium, and potassium is good for our health. So they're quite good, but they still taste salty. So we're actually quite addicted to the taste of salt, and sort of our taste receptors are used to having this really salty food. However, if you wean yourself off salt quite slowly, your taste buds adapt, and this means you actually like food with less salt, and you sort of are more sensitive to the taste of salt. Now, the problem with using potassium salt is that it doesn't help you to adapt to having less salt because you can still taste it. So from that point of view, we would sort of recommend that people go in for herbs and spices and things like that.
Is the man on the street generally aware about the damaging effect of too much salt?
Well, we did some research a couple of years ago that showed about 90% of people knew when asked that salt was bad for their health. However, when asked how it was bad for their health,
the
people
consequences.
didn't know exactly. And I think that's the kind of stage that we need to we need to get that through to people, because something's bad for your health. If you don't really know how, it's very difficult to motivate yourself to do anything about it. However, if you know what it can actually do, especially for people who might have heart disease or certain health conditions in their families, it's good, it's really important that people know exactly what salt is doing to their health or could be doing to their health.
Is the food industry doing its best to tackle the problem of too much salt in our diets?
They are doing a lot. I mean, salt content in some types of food have come down by nearly 50% over 10 years. So a lot of people would be quite surprised to know that. However, we still have a long way to go, and they are continuing to reduce their levels. But going back to what I was saying about the government, the food industry is very keen to have a level playing field. Now, this means that everybody reduces their salt levels at the same time. And as I said before, we're adapted to how much salt we eat. So if one food company reduces their salt and does a really good job and no one else follows, then they might be at sort of a disadvantage, because the rest of the food we're eating is meaning that we're still addicted to having too much salt. So it's really important that the government helps the food industry to maintain this level playing field. And this is the problem that we've got at the moment, and why the out-of-home sector, so your takeaways, your restaurants and your canteens, why it's really important that we do work to get them sort of in line with the supermarkets. Because at the moment the supermarkets want to do more and the home brands want to do more, but they can't necessarily, because the difference is becoming too difficult. So a good example of that would be with a ready meal. If you want a Chinese ready meal, the difference is becoming too big compared to a takeaway Chinese. So obviously when you get a ready meal, you're not expecting it to be the same, but you want it to be as close as possible. So it's really important that we start to tackle these, all these out-of-home restaurants, these takeaways, the Chinese takeaways, so that the ready meals can then be reduced more and we can generally eat less salt. Because we are eating about 1 in 6 meals out of the home now. So this could just be grabbing a sandwich or going out for dinner or grabbing breakfast on the go. But that's quite a lot of your, high percentage of your meals that you're now eating at home. So it's really important that more work's done there.
Can salt be good for you?
Can salt be good for you? Well, we need a very little amount. It's like other micronutrients in our body. We need it for normal function. However, we need such a small amount that you can get it from natural food products. So historically, 5,000 years ago, which is quite recent in terms of humans, we didn't need salt. We're one of the only mammals to consume salt. So it's something that we've adapted to, and we don't actually need it in anything more than we could get naturally from eating meat and vegetables. It's naturally in the soil. So we do need a little bit, and we're not saying remove it completely, but at the moment we're all eating so much more than we need that everyone would benefit from reducing their salt intake a little bit.
Does cash work with any other agencies?
We generally work by ourselves. We're quite independent, and this means that we can sort of rustle a few feathers here and there. But for Salt Awareness Week, we do team up with other health charities, so the British Heart Foundation, and this year we're focusing on stroke prevention. So we're working quite closely with the Stroke Association.
Is that one of the consequences of eating too much salt?
Yes, so eating too much salt puts up your blood pressure, and high blood pressure is responsible for 2/3 of all strokes. So the fact that salt increases your blood pressure and causes stroke is sort of, quite astonishing. So by reducing salt, we can obviously reduce stroke. And if we as a nation reduce our salt intake by just 1 gram a day, we can save 6,000 lives every year from strokes and heart attacks. So it's quite a big issue, and it is quite widely recognised now. The WHO, the World Health Organization, have listed it as important as tobacco control in terms of reducing disease. So, it's a really big issue.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is it a global issue?
It is a global issue, and the UK is actually leading the world. So while we may complain about sort of maybe the government's not quite doing enough, actually around the world, it's sort of a bigger issue because they haven't started or are only just starting to reduce levels in processed foods. And it's also more difficult in some countries. Like here, it's very easy to say, okay, 75% of the salt we eat is in processed foods, therefore that's what we need to focus on. However, in some countries, they eat less processed foods or different processed foods. So, the strategy does need to be slightly different. So it's not as simple as just copying us. But certainly countries like America and Australia could, and are starting to take our approach of setting targets for the food industry to reduce the salt intake of their populations.
And who founded CASH? And why?
CASH was founded in 1996 by Professor Graham McGregor, and he's our chairman and is still very actively involved with our work. And he set CASH up with a team of other medical experts who were interested in the effect that salt had on blood pressure and heart disease. And it was when there was some recommendations released saying that we should have a salt target, as we now do. However, at the time, the Chief Medical Officer refused to include sort of salt as one of our key recommendations, along with calories and fat and things like that. So they sort of did a lot of lobbying to the government to try and get salt recognised as something that we needed to control. And that has since happened. So the initial sort of 5 years of CASH was spent trying to get salt on everyone's radar, and now it's spent trying to reduce salt. So we've been really successful. The Food Standards Agency was set up in 2000, and they included salt as one of their key priorities. So that was where a lot of the government work was being done initially, and now that's moved to the Department of Health. So CASH has been involved sort of at every step of the way. So.
And how is CASH funded?
We have private funding, so
right. Is it a charity?
We are a charity, yes. So, and we have had some grants from individual, so from like the Food Standards Agency, we did a project with them, getting money for that, and the Department of Health as well.
What would you say is CASH's best achievement thus far, would you say? Well, since you've been established?
Getting salt sort of on everyone's radar, really. 10 years ago, people were not necessarily convinced or aware that salt is so bad for our health, and now it's one of the key government nutritional targets. So I think overall that is our big achievement, and getting up to 50% reductions in salt content of food. Okay, the food manufacturers have made the reductions themselves, but a lot of that will have come sort of from behind the scenes work with Cash, making a fuss and making sure that everyone takes it seriously.
And as it's Salt Awareness Week, what message would you like to give Greenboard online magazine readers and watchers?
Well, I'd just like to say to be aware that salt is hidden in your everyday food products. So perhaps you don't add salt to your food or your cooking, or you don't add it at the table, but this doesn't necessarily mean you're not eating too much. So it's quite good practice for everyday food products. So for instance, bread. Bread is the biggest contributor of salt to our diet, surprisingly. A lot of that is to do with the fact that we eat it, so for breakfast, we eat it for lunch, so we eat quite a lot. But perhaps next time you're in the supermarket and have a bit of time, just have a quick look at the food labels and find a lower salt bread, and then buy that bread in the future, and then that's done, and you can sort of automatically reduce your salt intake.
Is it all well labelled, the salt ingredients?
On the whole, salt is quite well labelled now. Often sodium is labelled instead of salt, and sodium is just a part of salt. So salt is sodium chloride. So often you'll see sodium on the label, and you actually need to times this by 2.5. So it's a bit confusing sometimes. However, this is being phased out now, and generally salt is going to be listed on all labels. So it's quite easy to know, at least for your everyday packaged foods. As I said, takeaway foods are not labelled, and some in-store bakery products are still not labelled, but on the whole things are labelled, and often with front of pack labelling with traffic lights. This is what we would always recommend that the food industry uses, and this just clearly shows you, using colours green, amber and red, whether or not a product is high or low in salt and fat and calories. So it's quite a good way of just at a glance choosing lower salt food. So I think the main message is just to be aware that it is hidden in surprising food products. Breakfast cereals, for instance, have some, and then you've also got the salty foods, so processed meats. They do taste a bit more salty. So it's just being aware that it does add up through your day, and if you are having, say, Marmite with butter on toast for breakfast and some cereal, and then you're having maybe some biscuits, like digestive biscuits can sometimes contain some salt, and then you're having something like bacon sandwich at lunchtime, and then a takeaway or a pizza or something for dinner, it can really
So you're going over your 6 grams of...
you could be quite easily, and it's not about the foods that you think of as salty. So people think crisps are quite salty. Actually, crisps are not that salty in comparison to other things. So it's just being aware that it does add up throughout the day, and wherever possible to sort of choose lower salt options. Don't add salt to your cooking. There's plenty of other things out there.
Lots to think about.
Yes.
Hannah Brisden, thank you very much. David Barry, Green Borders online magazine at the Wolfson Institute of Preventative Medicine. Thank you very much.